Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. That's when Vanessa Kroll stood on my grandfather's hillside with a clipboard and a hard hat she didn't need, and said the words I'll never forget. "These old rock walls are a liability, Mr. Coombs. The association voted. They come down Thursday." Behind her, 4 men in a bucket loader idled at the property line, engine coughing diesel smoke into the September air. Vanessa was wearing a cream-coloured blazer that cost more than my truck payment, gold bangles clicking every time she flipped a page on that clipboard. Her white Range Rover sat in the turnaround, still ticking as it cooled. Here are the numbers that should have stopped her cold. Those stone terraces had held that slope in place for 114 years. They stepped down the hillside in 11 distinct tiers, each wall built by hand from quarried limestone, each one older than the paved road that brought her up here. And above those terraces sat 41 homes in Summit View Estates, homes that existed only because that hillside had never once moved. Vanessa didn't know any of that, or she didn't care, because what she really wanted wasn't a view deck. What she wanted was $3.4 million from a resort developer who needed unobstructed sightlines to close his deal. And a hillside full of 100-year-old rock walls didn't photograph well in a glossy brochure. By the time the rains came that November, this quiet mountain community would be a national news story. County commissioners would hold emergency sessions, a grand jury would be seated, and Vanessa Kroll, the woman standing on my dead grandfather's land telling me what I was and wasn't allowed to protect, would end up owing more money than she ever thought she'd see in her lifetime. Almost none of it would come out of her checking account. What she didn't know that Tuesday afternoon, what none of them knew, was that I'd been walking that slope with survey stakes and inclinometers for 11 straight years. I had a filing cabinet full of certified soil reports with my signature on every page. And buried in the association's own records they handed me themselves, thinking I was just some retired old farmer who wouldn't know how to read them, was a permit application. Her permit application, with my professional stamp forged onto the bottom of it. She thought she was clearing an obstruction. She was signing her own arrest warrant. My name is Walter Coombs. Everybody calls me Walt. I'm 63 years old, and until 4 years ago, I spent my career as a licensed geotechnical engineer, the last 18 years of it consulting for the Army Corps of Engineers, on slope stability projects from the Cascades to the Appalachians. Before that, I did 2 tours with a combat engineering battalion, building things that needed to hold and tearing down things that needed to fall, safely, deliberately, on purpose. I know the difference between the two. Most people don't. I came home to Coombs Hollow the year my father passed, to finish what 4 generations of my family started on this hillside above what used to be nothing but scrub oak and cattle pasture. Now it's called Summit View Estates, 41 houses, each one worth $800,000 or more, all of them sitting up there on land that used to be Coombs grazing ground before the developers bought the upper acreage from my uncle back in 1998. And I couldn't do a damn thing about it. But they never got my 22 acres. The hollow itself, the terraces, the spring house, the old barn that still smells like hay dust and machine oil even after all these years, that's mine. My great-grandfather Ezra Coombs carved this place out of the hillside in 1911, 1 wagon load of quarried limestone at a time. He built those terraces not for beauty, but because the man understood something that Vanessa Kroll's engineers apparently never bothered to learn. A hillside that steep, with that kind of clay soil underneath, will not hold water. Left alone, gravity wins every single time. The terraces weren't decoration. They were load-bearing walls, stepping the water down slow, giving the soil time to drink instead of drown. Ezra used to tell my grandfather, and my grandfather told my father, and my father told me, standing right there at the second terrace with his hand flat against the warm stone. This wall right here has never moved a half inch since the day my daddy set it. You take care of it, it'll take care of everybody living above it. I believed him. I believe him still. There's a hand-carved oak dining table inside my farmhouse, made in 1899 by Ezra's own father before he even bought this land. The same table where 3 generations of Coombs men signed deeds, wrote wills, and once, in 1953, spread out a map of this exact hillside to plan where the 3rd and 4th terraces should go. 3 generations of my family are buried in the small cemetery behind the springhouse, under a stand of black walnut trees that drop their bitter-smelling husks every October. I know every sound this land makes. I know the particular groan of the barn door hinge on a cold morning, the low mineral smell of well water pumped up from 300 feet down, the exact pitch of wind moving through limestone crevices before a storm rolls in off the ridge. I am not a rich man. My truck is 11 years old. My boots have been resoled twice. To anybody looking in from the outside, and Vanessa Kroll looked, believe me, she looked hard, I was just a stubborn old rancher squatting on prime real estate the association desperately wanted access through. What she didn't know was what I carried in my back pocket. 2 things actually, and she wouldn't learn about either one until it was far, far too late. Vanessa Kroll was 51 years old, president of the Summit View Homeowners Association for 6 years running, and by every outward measure, a woman who had made it. She drove that Range Rover with the vanity plate reading Summit 1. She wore blazers from a boutique in the city that didn't put price tags in the window. She carried a leather portfolio everywhere she went, even to backyard barbecues, like she was perpetually one signature away from closing a deal that would change her life. Turns out she was. She'd married into money the first time, divorced out of it the second, and clawed her way onto the board of a homeowners association because she'd figured out something most people never do. Control the paperwork, control the money. 6 years as president meant 6 years of assessment fees flowing through accounts she controlled. 6 years of vendor contracts she approved. 6 years of nobody on that volunteer board asking the kinds of questions a forensic accountant might ask. That Tuesday, she left my property with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a promise that sounded more like a threat. You'll get the official notice by Friday, Mr. Coombs. I'd recommend you don't make this difficult. I didn't say a word back to her. I just took out my phone, the same flip-style recorder I'd carried in my breast pocket since my core days out of habit, and I noted the time. Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. Then I walked the property line after she left, photographing the survey stakes her contractor had already driven into my grandfather's terraces. Pink flags marking demolition zones on land that wasn't even inside the association's easement. Friday came just like she said. The notice arrived by certified mail, return receipt requested, which told me right away that she wanted a paper trail. Fine, so did I. The letter was 3 pages, printed on association letterhead with a raised seal that looked almost official enough to fool somebody who hadn't spent 4 decades reading government documents for a living. It cited a section of the CC&R, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions every homeowner in Summit View had supposedly signed, claiming that unmaintained agricultural structures adjacent to the community viewshed constituted a safety hazard subject to association remediation under Article 7, Section 3. There was just one problem. My 22 acres weren't part of Summit View Estates. They never had been. My great-grandfather's land had never been annexed into that HOA, never been platted into that subdivision, and I had never signed a single covenant in my life. I read that letter 3 times at my kitchen table, the same 1899 oak table my great-great-grandfather built, running my thumb along a groove worn smooth by 5 generations of hands. Then I got up, walked to the filing cabinet in the back room where I kept every land record, deed, and survey my family had accumulated since 1911, and I pulled the original plat map. There it was, in surveyor's ink, 60 years old and still perfectly legible. The boundary line separating Coombs land from what would eventually become Summit View Estates. My hollow was never inside their fence, never inside their authority, never inside their jurisdiction to condemn, cite, or demolish anything. They knew that, or they should have, which meant the letter wasn't a mistake. It was a test to see if a quiet old man living alone on a hillside would just roll over rather than fight a homeowners association with lawyers on retainer. I didn't roll over. I photographed the letter, the envelope, the postmark, and the certified mail receipt. I made 4 copies. I put the originals in a fireproof lockbox my father had used for the farm's tax records, and I started a folder. I labelled it simply Evidence. Then I drove into town and filed a written response with the county recorder's office, attaching the plat map, formally disputing the association's claimed authority over my property, and requesting, in writing, notarized, that all future communication be documented and retained. I wanted them on record making claims they couldn't support. I wanted them building a case against themselves without realizing it. 3 days later, the bucket loader showed up anyway. I stood at my kitchen window that morning, coffee going cold in my hand, and watched 4 men in hard hats walk onto the second terrace like they owned it. No permit posted, no county inspector present, no notice on file with the state agency that regulates earthwork on slopes exceeding 15% grade, and this hillside ran closer to 32. I walked out onto my porch. I didn't shout, I didn't threaten. I raised my phone and I started recording. "Morning," I said to the crew foreman, a heavy-set man named Dale who wouldn't meet my eyes. "You have a permit for grading on private land?" "We're working for the association," Dale said. "They said this was cleared." "Cleared by who? This parcel's not in the HOA's easement. You're standing on land that's never belonged to Summit View." Dale looked back at his crew, then at the loader, then finally pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to me like it might bite him. It was a permit application, filed with the county planning office, signed supposedly by a licensed engineer authorizing removal of unstable agricultural retaining structures on the hillside above Summit View Estates. The signature at the bottom read, "Walter J. Combs, P.E., license number TX-47821. My license number, my name, a signature that wasn't mine. I stood there on my own porch steps holding a forged document with my professional credentials stamped across the bottom of it, authorizing the destruction of the exact structures I'd spent 11 years monitoring to protect. My hands went cold before my mind caught up to what I was looking at. Somebody had used my name to give themselves legal cover. Somebody had committed forgery and possibly fraud against a state licensing board, just to bulldoze a hillside for a better view. I told Dale and his crew to stand down, that I'd be filing a police report within the hour, and that if a single stone moved off that hillside before the county investigated, every man on that crew would be named in a civil suit alongside the association. They packed up fast. Dale at least had the sense to be scared. I called the sheriff's office. I called the Texas Board of Professional Engineers. I called the county planning department. Every call, I noted the time, the name of who I spoke with, and I followed up each conversation with a written letter, sent certified, because I have learned in 63 years that people forget phone calls. They don't forget paper. That's when I met Ruth Aldridge. She lived 2 properties over, technically inside the Summit View boundary, a small stone cottage tucked into the hillside that her late husband built with his own hands back in 1974, before any of this was a subdivision. Ruth was 78 years old, a widow, a former army nurse who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, evacuating wounded soldiers under fire. She now carried an oxygen tank everywhere she went, tubing looped behind her ears, the soft hiss of it a constant companion. She showed up at my gate the afternoon the crew left, moving slow across the gravel, one hand gripping her cane, the other pulling a small wheeled cart with her oxygen tank riding on top. "Walter," she said, out of breath before she even reached my porch steps. "They're trying to make me sign something." She handed me a document from the association, a voluntary easement transfer that would have granted Summit View HOA right to install drainage infrastructure across Ruth's property, conveniently routing right along the base of my terraces. Buried in paragraph 4, in language designed to be skimmed past by an exhausted woman managing a chronic illness, was a clause releasing the association from any liability related to pre-existing structural conditions on adjacent parcels. They were trying to get Ruth to sign away her right to sue them before the Hillside even moved. And they were targeting her specifically because she was old, alone, on a fixed income, and, I'd learn later, 3 months behind on her HOA assessments after a hospital stay had drained her savings. "Don't sign anything," I told her. "Not one thing, not until I look at every page." That was the moment the fight stopped being about my land and started being about something bigger. Ruth Aldridge had served her country. She'd spent decades in this hollow, paid her dues, buried her husband on a hillside she loved. And Vanessa Kroll's association was trying to strip mine her dignity along with the land. I spent the next 6 weeks doing what I do best, reading documents nobody else wanted to read. I filed open records requests with the county for every permit application submitted by Summit View HOA over the past 3 years. I requested association financial disclosures through the state's HOA Transparency Statute, Texas Property Code, Section 209.005, which requires homeowners associations to make financial records available to any member or, in specific circumstances, to affected adjacent property owners contesting boundary disputes. What came back nearly stopped my heart. Buried inside a Capital Improvement Fund ledger, in a line item labelled simply Viewshed Enhancement Project, Phase 1, was a wire transfer. $2.1 million, deposited 8 months earlier from an LLC called Ridgecrest Resort Holdings. Not a loan, not an investment, a deposit, against a total contracted sum of $3.4 million for what the accompanying contract described as exclusive development and viewshed access rights to the Summit View Hillside parcel. Vanessa Kroll had sold view rights to a resort developer, rights she didn't own, over land that wasn't fully hers to sell, using an HOA board that likely had no idea what she'd actually signed. And demolishing my great-grandfather's terraces wasn't collateral damage in some misguided beautification project. It was the entire plan. The second red line came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after I'd found that wire transfer sitting in the association's books like a smoking gun nobody bothered to hide well enough. I was up before dawn, same as always, checking the inclinometer readings I'd buried at 4 points along the hillside back in 2016. Thin steel casings sunk 20 feet into the clay, each one wired to a small data logger in my barn that recorded slope movement down to fractions of a degree. The soil had been shifting, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that any engineer worth his license would have called it a warning sign, not a nuisance to be graded away. I heard the loader before I saw it, that low diesel growl carrying up the hollow on cold air, the kind of sound that travels farther than it should before sunrise. I grabbed my phone and walked out to the edge of my property, and what I saw made my stomach drop clean through the floor of me. They weren't on my land this time, they were on Ruth's. Dale's crew, the same loader, though this time with 2 additional men I didn't recognize, had driven straight through Ruth Aldridge's side yard, tearing up a section of drainage swale that ran along the property line, right past the small stone memorial her husband had built for their son, who died in infancy back in 1976. It wasn't a grave, it was a marker, a flat granite stone with a carved lamb on it, sitting under an old cedar tree Ruth had planted the same year. The loader's bucket clipped the edge of that memorial garden, crushed a row of irises Ruth had been tending for going on 5 decades, and kept moving because whoever was driving either didn't see it or didn't care. I was recording the whole thing on my phone from across the fence line, and I heard Ruth before I saw her. That thin, oxygen-starved voice carrying across the yard, cane in one hand, tubing bouncing against her cheek as she hurried out onto her porch in her housecoat. "That's my son's marker. Stop. You stop right there." The foreman didn't stop, not right away. It took Ruth screaming a second time and me vaulting the low stone wall between our properties despite my niece telling me exactly how bad an idea that was before Dale finally threw the machine into neutral. "We got a work order," he said, not looking at either of us. "Drainage remediation, association property." "This is not association property," I said, my voice flat and low, the tone I used to use giving orders in the field. "This is Ruth Aldridge's private residence, and you just destroyed a memorial to a dead child." Dale had the decency to go pale. The two men I didn't recognize did not. One of them, a younger guy in a Ridgecrest Resort Holdings polo shirt, not an association shirt, a developer's shirt, actually smirked and said, "It's just some rocks, man." I got that on video too, every second of it, timestamped, geotagged, his face clear as day. Ruth sat down hard on her porch steps, oxygen tank rattling against the wood, and she didn't cry, not exactly, but her whole body seemed to fold in on itself the way a woman's does when 78 years of dignity finally hits a wall too high to climb over. I sat down next to her, put my arm around her thin shoulders, and I made her a promise right there. "They're going to answer for this, Ruth. Every bit of it. I need you to let me handle it the right way, the legal way. It'll take longer than either of us wants, but it'll stick." She nodded, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and said something I've carried with me since. "Walter, I buried my boy on this land in 1976. I buried my husband here in 2009. I am not leaving this hillside to people who can't even be bothered to drive around a dead child's memorial stone." That's when something in me went cold and steady, the same feeling I used to get before a demolition op, when emotion had to get out of the way so precision could take over. I called the sheriff's department first, requesting a deputy respond to document property damage and potential criminal mischief under Texas Penal Code Section 28.03, intentional damage to property, elevated given the presence of a memorial marker, which under state law can qualify for enhanced penalties as desecration, depending on how the DA chose to charge it. A deputy named Cordero showed up within 40 minutes, walked the scene with me, photographed the crushed irises and the gouged earth around the marker, and took a full statement from Ruth. Here's what most homeowners don't know, and what I made sure Deputy Cordero understood clearly before he left. An HOA's authority, no matter what the covenants say, does not extend to unilateral entry and demolition on a homeowner's private lot without written notice, a hearing, and in most cases, a court order if the homeowner disputes the action. Texas Property Code Section 209.006 requires associations to provide written notice and a reasonable opportunity to cure before taking enforcement action, and nothing in that statute authorizes an HOA to send a bulldozer crew onto a resident's yard unannounced at 6 in the morning. Deputy Cordero filed the report. I made copies. Ruth signed a sworn statement, and I added it all to the folder that was growing thicker by the week. But the deeper trap, the one that mattered, wasn't going to be built out of anger. It was going to be built out of paperwork, patience, and the quiet accumulation of documented, undeniable fact. Here's where it gets interesting. I drove to the county courthouse the following Monday and filed for an emergency temporary restraining order against Summit View HOA and Ridgecrest Resort Holdings, citing ongoing unauthorized construction activity on private property, imminent risk of slope failure under Texas Water Code Section 11.086, which prohibits any landowner or entity from diverting or altering natural drainage in a manner that damages another person's property, and the criminal mischief report from Ruth's property as supporting evidence of bad faith conduct. The judge granted it within 72 hours. Cease all grading, cease all demolition, pending a full hearing. That should have stopped them. It didn't, not completely, but it forced everything they did next into the light. Because now, every action they took was in direct, documented violation of a signed court order. And I had eyes on that hillside 24 hours a day. I hired a private survey firm out of my own pocket to conduct a formal slope stability assessment, time-stamped and notarized, cross-referencing it against my own 11 years of inclinometer data. I filed copies with the county engineer's office, the state licensing board investigating the forged permit, and, critically, with the office of the district attorney, who by now had opened a preliminary inquiry into the forged engineering signature. I also reached out to a reporter I'd known slightly for years, a woman named Denise Okafor, who covered county government for the regional paper. I didn't ask her to write anything yet. I asked her to simply watch, to file a public records request of her own for the HOA's board meeting minutes going back 3 years, and to be ready when the story broke. Because a story built on real documents filed by an independent journalist under her own authority carries a weight that nothing I said myself ever could. What would you have done sitting where I was sitting, watching a woman who served her country get her dead son's memorial run over by a bulldozer, while the woman responsible drove a Range Rover paid for by money she hadn't earned? Let me know in the comments below and tell me where you're watching this from, because I'd bet money some of you have lived through your own version of this fight with an HOA that thought paperwork was the same thing as power. I wasn't interested in revenge for its own sake. I wanted something better. I wanted every piece of what they'd done laid out so cleanly, so undeniably, that when the Hillside finally did what I already knew it was going to do, there would be no question left standing about who caused it, who covered it up, and who paid the price. The rains were coming. My data told me that much with mere certainty. A wet fall pattern building off the Gulf, soil saturation levels already climbing past what those terraces, in their damaged and half-demolished state, could safely hold. All I had to do now was make sure the paper trail was airtight before the mud started moving. The rain started on a Sunday night in November, and it did not stop. I'd been tracking the forecast for 11 days by then, cross-referencing satellite data with my own soil moisture readings, watching the numbers climb toward a threshold I already knew by heart. By Wednesday, my inclinometers were logging movement I'd never seen in 11 years of monitoring, nearly 2 full inches of lateral displacement in 72 hours. That doesn't sound like much until you understand what it means. It means the hillside was no longer holding. It was sliding. I had a legal and professional duty to report it under Texas Occupations Code Section 1001.406, which requires a licensed engineer to disclose imminent danger to public safety, regardless of personal conflict or dispute. So Wednesday morning, I drove into the county emergency management office myself, laid my certified data on the director's desk, and told her, plainly, that the hillside above Summit View Estates was going to fail, likely within days, and that 41 homes sat directly in the path. She issued a voluntary evacuation notice that afternoon. Vanessa Kroll called an emergency HOA meeting that same night and told her residents not to panic. I know this because Denise Okafor was in that room, recording it for the paper. Vanessa stood up in front of 60 frightened homeowners and said the county was overreacting to normal seasonal rainfall, that the terraces had been an outdated liability regardless, and that Ridgecrest's engineers, the same engineers who'd never once set foot on that slope, had assured her the new drainage design was sound. Nobody in that room knew there was no new drainage design. There was just a hole where 11 stone terraces used to stand. Thursday night at 11:52 p.m, the hillside came down. I was standing on my porch when I heard it. Not a crash, but a long, low groan, like the earth itself was exhaling something it had held too long. Then the sound of it moving, a wet, grinding roar that rolled down the hollow and up into the estates above, swallowing porch lights one by one as it went. I watched 3 houses lose power in under a minute, then 5, then I stopped counting. By the time county rescue crews reached the scene before dawn, 11 homes had partial structural collapse from mud flow, and 6 were buried up to their second-story windows in wet clay and limestone rubble. The very stone my great-grandfather had quarried coming home at last, uninvited, to the doorsteps of the people who'd torn it loose. One of those 6 homes belonged to Vanessa Kroll. I stood at the county's command post the next morning alongside Deputy Cordero, the district emergency director, and Denise Okafor with her recorder running, and I laid out everything. 11 years of inclinometer data, the certified slope stability assessment from the independent survey firm, the forged permit bearing my stolen engineering license number, and the wire transfer records showing $2.1 million flowing from Ridgecrest Resort Holdings into an HOA capital account that funded nothing but Vanessa Kroll's demolition crew and, it turned out, a fair amount of her personal credit card debt. She authorized removal of load-bearing structures she was told, in writing, not to touch, I said, loud enough for the cameras Denise had tipped off to catch every word. This slope failure isn't a natural disaster, it's a manufactured one, and I have 11 years of paperwork proving it. Vanessa arrived at the scene 20 minutes later, mud-streaked, having waded out of her half-buried garage, still wearing yesterday's blazer, now ruined. She saw the cameras, she saw me standing with the county director, and for the first time since I'd met her, I watched her face lose every ounce of that clipboard confidence. "This is a natural disaster," she said, loud, to nobody and everybody. "Nobody could have predicted this." "I predicted it in writing 4 months ago," I said, and handed the director a certified copy of my original report, dated and notarized, the same one Vanessa's board had received and ignored. Denise stepped forward with her recorder. "Kroll, can you explain the $2.1 million deposit from Ridgecrest Resort Holdings into the HOA Capital Fund?" Vanessa didn't answer. She turned to leave. That's when the county sheriff's detective, who'd been standing quietly at the edge of the command post, waiting for exactly this moment, stepped forward with a warrant already signed. "Vanessa Kroll, you're under arrest for forgery of a professional seal under Texas Penal Code Section 32.21 and felony theft under Section 31.03. They cuffed her right there, in front of her neighbours, in front of the cameras, in front of the ruined outline of the house she'd bought with money that was never really hers. Residents who'd stood behind her at every meeting for 6 years, who'd cheered when the terraces came down for their unobstructed view, now watched in silence as she was walked to a patrol car past the very mudslide her signature had authorised. The polo-shirted Ridgecrest employee who'd smirked over Ruth's crushed memorial was arrested 2 days later on criminal mischief charges. Dale, the foreman, cooperated fully with investigators and was never charged. He'd been following orders from paperwork he had no reason to doubt. The trial took 7 months. Vanessa Kroll pled guilty to forgery of a professional engineering seal, felony theft from a homeowners association exceeding $200,000, and criminal contempt for violating the restraining order I'd secured before the slide. The judge sentenced her to 6 years in state prison and ordered personal restitution of $80,000. Nearly every liquid asset she had left after her home, her Range Rover, and her jewellery was seized and auctioned. Almost none of that $80,000 came from anything resembling honest income. It came from a life built on other people's assessment checks. The larger sum, the full $2.1 million embezzled deposit, plus the remaining balance of the $3.4 million development contract, was recovered through a separate civil forfeiture action against Ridgecrest Resort Holdings, whose executives settled rather than face conspiracy charges tied to the forged permit. That money went into a court-supervised remediation fund covering slope stabilization, home repairs, and relocation costs for displaced families. Ruth Aldridge's memorial was rebuilt by county contractors at no cost to her, using the original granite lamb, recovered nearly intact from the mud 3 weeks after the slide. She was elected the new president of Summit View HOA that spring, unopposed, and one of her first acts was voting to waive assessment fees for any resident facing hardship, something Vanessa Kroll had never once considered in 6 years of holding that gavel. The county required full reconstruction of the terraces, engineered to my original specifications, funded by the remediation settlement. I oversaw the work myself, walking the hillside every morning with a level and a notebook, watching my great-grandfather's design rise back out of the earth, one hand-set stone at a time. Ruth comes by most Sundays now. We sit on my porch, her oxygen tank humming quietly beside her chair, and we watch the terraces hold steady through every hard rain that comes rolling off the ridge. Sometimes she brings a pie. Sometimes we just sit in the kind of comfortable silence two people earn after surviving something together. Here's what I learned, watching all of it unfold. Paperwork outlasts arrogance every single time, if you're patient enough to let it. The people most likely to underestimate you are the ones standing on ground they don't understand. Protecting the vulnerable isn't a moral extra, it's the whole point of having power at all. And some walls were never meant to come down, no matter how good the view looks without them. The oak table in my kitchen has a new set of documents on it these days, a letter from a homeowners association 2 counties over, asking if I'd consult on a retaining wall dispute that sounds, from what little they've told me, uncomfortably familiar. I haven't answered them yet, but I've already pulled out a fresh folder. I sat there a long moment with that letter in my hand, listening to the barn door groan on its hinge, the way it always does when the wind shifts before evening. Ruth was still on the porch, working a needle through a quilt square, glasses pushed down her nose. "You're going to say yes," she said without looking up. "I can already tell." "I haven't decided anything." "Walter, you pulled out a folder. Nobody pulls out a folder unless they've already decided." She wasn't wrong. She's rarely wrong, which is one of the things I've come to appreciate most about her these past months. I set the letter down on the oak table, next to a coffee ring that had probably been there since my father's time, and I let my mind drift back to the courtroom, because some part of me still needed to sit with what had actually happened before I went looking for the next fight. The sentencing hearing had been held in the old county courthouse downtown, the kind of building with high plaster ceilings and slow-turning fans that never quite cooled the room. I remember the sound most, the shuffle of nearly 80 people packed into a gallery built for maybe 50, half of them Summit View residents who'd once stood behind Vanessa Kroll at every HOA meeting, nodding along as she promised them a view worth millions. Now they sat with their arms crossed, faces hard, listening to a prosecutor read out exactly how she'd spent their trust. Vanessa didn't cry, I'll give her that much. She sat straight-backed at the defense table in a plain grey suit, nothing like the cream blazer she'd worn the day she stood on my hillside and told me my family's terraces were coming down whether I liked it or not. Her lawyer argued for leniency, citing her community contributions and previously unblemished record. The judge, a woman named Patricia Ruiz, who I'd come to respect a great deal over those 7 months, looked unimpressed. "Miss Kroll," Judge Ruiz said, "you didn't just steal money. You endangered 41 families and desecrated a grieving mother's memorial to her child. Also, a resort developer could put a swimming pool where a mountain used to hold itself together. The court does not find that context mitigating. It finds it aggravating." I watched something in Vanessa's shoulders drop when the judge said that. Not remorse, I don't think. More like the particular deflation of a person realizing, for the first time, that the story she'd been telling herself about who she was no longer matched the story everyone else was hearing. After the hearing, out on the courthouse steps, a woman I recognized from the old HOA meetings, a soft-spoken widow named Carol Ferris, who'd lost half her sunroom to the mudslide, came up to me and just stood there a second before she spoke. "I voted for her every single year," Carol said. "I brought her banana bread at Christmas. I feel like a fool." "You're not a fool," I told her. "You trusted somebody whose entire job was making sure you didn't have a reason not to." "That's not on you." She nodded slowly, like she wanted to believe it, and maybe over time she has. Carol's one of the residents whose rebuilding costs got fully covered under the remediation fund, and last I heard, she'd started showing up to Ruth's HOA meetings with a notebook of her own, asking sharper questions than she ever had before. That's the part that stays with me longest, more than the arrest, more than the verdict. Watching a community that had been trained to nod along slowly relearn how to ask questions. Ruth's swearing in as HOA president happened on a cold, clear morning in the same clubhouse where Vanessa used to run her meetings from behind a podium flanked by a projector screen full of glossy renderings. Ruth didn't use a podium. She sat at a folding table with her oxygen tank parked beside her chair, and she opened the meeting by reading, word for word, the section of the Texas Property Code requiring financial transparency to every homeowner present. The same section I'd used to pull the thread that unraveled the whole scheme. "We're going to do things differently around here," she told the room, and I remember the sound of that room going very quiet, the particular quiet of people who've been burned once and are finally paying attention. Starting with the fact that I will personally read every contract this board signs, out loud, before any vote. There was a ripple of laughter, tired but real, the kind of laughter that comes after something painful finally starts healing. I sat in the back row that day, next to Denise Okafor, who leaned over and whispered that her paper wanted to do a full retrospective piece once the terraces were finished, not just on the fraud, but on the rebuilding, on Ruth, on the hillside itself, standing back up out of the mud, one stone at a time. I told her that sounded fine by me, so long as she got the engineering right. Some habits, I suppose, never really leave a man.